Dear Hiroaki, you, as author of probably one of the best books on the history of the Donbas, were following what's going on now, and you also published a number of publications. So why, following the conflict in the east of Ukraine and in your recent publication, what is a major take? What we understand about this region and about, currently? So what the history helps us to understand?
Interesting question. Of course, the more I study the place, the more difficult to understand. Maybe that's the nature of anything. But I think we have some ideas of why the conflict developed and where possibly the Donbas may be heading.
Where?
Well, again, it's not easy to determine exactly where it's heading. It's certainly it's extremely chaotic. It's certainly difficult to know exactly what the people living in the occupied territory and in the Ukrainian territory. I think many poles are sort of conflicting. Sometimes it's very discouraging because even though the people who are living in the Ukrainian-controlled territory may not be particularly in favor of what the Ukrainian government is doing. So it seems to me that yes, even those who may be supporting the LNR, basically protesting this power structure in Kyiv, which they think is not doing much to help or to promote the Donbas. So it seems to me that there's sort of old, conflict, old distrust between the Donbas and the power center of Kyiv may still be there. In that sense, yes, solving this won't be easy, but I do think that it's not impossible, particularly because it seems to me that they certainly lost the prospect of joining Russia. Moscow doesn't seem to want Russia. Moscow doesn't seem to like to include Donbas. They don't want to include the Donbas into Russia. So they have only two choices, basically: stay as small independent states which no one will recognize, or somehow to find ways to work within the Ukrainian state.
How much should we look back at the history of Donbas area while looking at the current conflict? Because there are also different opinions among the humanitarians, among the historians. Some people search the reasons in the Soviet time, in recent history, in Russian-speaking population. But what is your take on that?
Just how the history is affecting...
Yeah. And is it underestimated or overestimated in this current conflict?
Well, it depends on who underestimated, who overestimated. I think everyone knew that Donbas was a problem place. You see, Kyiv certainly understood it. But what changed is that these Donbas people came to really take Ukrainian Kyiv power structure. And I think they tried to use it to enrich themselves and then, of course, help the Donbas. But then, of course, Russia started intervening because they had hoped that Yanukovych would follow Moscow's dictation. It was not entirely clear. Certainly they were under the very strong influence of Moscow, but they also played with the West, whether they can extract, or how much concession they could extract from Europe. And I think in the end, they were forced to choose the Russian path, which of course caused, this rebellion in late 2014. When I was reading this book by Pavel Gubarev, for example, he says...
You would just probably explain who is Pavel Gubarev.
He says that if Yanukovych had followed the European path, the Donbas population would have followed it without much protest. So I think the people are willing to see where they could go. European path would be acceptable as long as they think that their life would be better off. Now, whether they would have accepted Yanukovych, that I don't know. But I think the way I look at the Donbas is the old tendency of living between two power centers and sort of finding the best course for themselves without necessarily following these two paths.
And how much there are still already 2 years after, there are enough of those speaking about the Russian language issue, the ethnical difference, the Soviet mentality. How, what is your opinion on that?
I don't think the language was ever an issue. I mean, older people may not be able to speak Russian, but every young people from the Donbas speak decent Ukrainian. It may not be their mother tongue, but they certainly accepted it. They are willing to speak it if it's necessary. There might be some angry people, but it's a bilingual place, even if the Russian language is dominant. So I don't think the language issue was there. I don't think there were ethnic issues either, but someone may say that this person is I'm a Ukrainian, but if you go, if you follow their genealogical lines, it may turn out that they might be something different. I don't think there were any ethnic issues. I think they got along very well, Ukrainian Russians and other people. Even Gubarev said so. Interesting, huh? There was no ethnic problems. It's in his book, it's written there. So all these issues, however, in small quantity they may have existed, well, of course, blown out by Moscow into incredible, proportions. They distort the whole issue. So I don't see it. Historically speaking, there weren't any serious issues. There are certain resistance by Russian-speaking people to Ukrainization, but that resistance was limited. Historically, in the 1920s, 1930s, limited. Even after Ukraine became independent, I don't think resistance was particularly strong. There are small cores of die-hard Russian nationalists. They seem to have been there. But even Gubarev says until the rebellion, there were very few of them.
And there is also the discussion about, some particular mentality and how much this kind of discussion are also appropriate, some mentality of patriarchic society which wants to have a stronger hand and, is more mentally closer to Moscow or something like that, or not rebellious enough. But you've come to Donbas in 90s where there was a lot of strikes. So what would be your explanation of this kind of a Donbas character?
Talk about the Soviet, Soviet mentality. Sure, I mean, but they lived their adult lives, many of them, in the Soviet period. They understood how the Soviet system works, so they followed it. But look, 1989 they rebelled. In the 1990s, after Ukraine they rebelled. They were not necessarily wanted to go back to the Soviet past. They wanted more power. I think they wanted more input into their own lives because everything was controlled from above. They followed the line. They knew how to get along, but it didn't work. Or they were angry. So they certainly wanted to have their own say, which, of course, was not well clearly accepted by powerful people. So they were exploring. Now, these patriarchal structure sometimes helps because the benefits come from above, right? If the institutions don't work, what are we going to do? Well, if the top gives us something that will work. So that sort of is a desperate attempt to secure their daily existence. I don't think that it was what they actually wanted. See, it's all dependent on the top. No, that's not how people live. So I don't think they knew how the Soviet system works. The Soviet system tends to be very patriarchal, party controlled, government controlled. But I don't think they were happy in the Soviet period. They knew the system. They knew how to live in the system. But I don't think that that was what they actually wanted. They certainly explored alternatives. Some strikes they staged were sort of attempts to explore some of the better ways of organizing life.
I know that's not a question so much for the historians, but a lot of people from the civil society, government, everybody, how to, bridge the country back. But still, how do you see this kind of a very random separation line and the way that there is this kind of a creation of a, self-proclaimed, but not controlled by the government state, and this kind of division, what it has an impact, because it looks for me that it's very random why one village is under Ukrainian control, another is under the separatist control. But what impact it can have on the society, and can this divide be there, and what impact it has in the long term?
Yeah, in one respect, it certainly will depend on how Moscow will try to solve this problem. Because even though Moscow denies that it has intervened in the Donbas affair, of course it has. So what kinds of directions will come from Moscow is one important element. Another important element is, of course, how Ukrainians will deal with it. And I certainly am against those who think that, well, Donbas, no good for Ukraine, we can get rid of it. If these people want to keep it from Ukraine, that's fine. There are people who say so. I don't think it's a good idea if other people want to rebel, like Kharkiv or Odessa. Are we going to make concessions to these people? No, there is no way of stopping. Now, reintegrating the Donbas into Ukraine it won't be easy. They took arms, they killed each other, yes, and clearly, particularly those who have taken arms are angry with Kyiv, if not Ukraine per se, millions of people. So what kind of settlement can be worked out? I believe that it can. What form it will take, how long it will take, but I think Kyiv ought to be very patient. And last year when I spoke at the review, I said, yeah, it won't be easy, it will be terribly difficult, but look, Ukrainians and Poles killed each other many years ago, or at the end of World War II. The casualties were far bigger. Now, well, we may not be able to, accept what happened, but still, Poland and Ukraine go along, get along rather well, despite solving the historical questions. So I think, depending on situations, I think there is always a possibility of reintegrating Ukraine. I mean, the Donbas, which were taken by these fighters.
And Hiroaki, you, while your last visit, you were also saying that you're researching the way how undercover operations were done during the Stalin time in different regions, something very similar which happened in Crimea and Donbas with, this, as they were called, not kind of really little green man, but something similar. So what you know on that, how you can elaborate on that? So is it really a last old Soviet practice to do this undercover operation?
Certainly so. Stalin was very good at it. In various parts of particularly Asia, but also in the 1920s in Poland, they deployed their own subversive forces, military forces, under the guise of local fighters, like Chinese fighters, Mongolian fighters. Like,
can you explain more? Because we know a lot about Poland, more or less, and Finland and the Baltic states, but very little on the Far East borders of
you see,
the Soviet Union.
Asia at that time, is some hinterland. No one cared about Asia, but of course, most Western countries were trying to colonize China and other places. Yeah. Of course, Soviet Union was not colonizing power, at least on the surface. They tried to avoid being a colonial, try to avoid appearing as a colonial power. But of course, they controlled the Chinese railway until 1935. They colonized basically Outer Mongolia, which became Mongolian People's Republic. It's probably the first satellite state of the Soviet Union. And then later on, after World War II, Soviet Union used its experience with Mongolia to Eastern Europe. So they were experimenting certain things in Mongolia. Now there, yeah, of course, they did all kinds of things. In Xinjiang, which was Western, called Eastern Turkestan, where most Muslims were living, they were rebelling against Han Chinese. The Kuomintang people said, "Oh, this is great. This is a national liberation movement." This is in the early 1930s. Stalin said, "No. We have to help the Chinese because these Muslims might be helped by the Japanese and Britain." In that case, those imperial powers come to, this area, which faces the Soviet Union. This is very dangerous. So of course, Stalin sent his own military forces under the guise of Chinese soldiers and helped the Chinese government to crush these Muslim rebels.
But we also, you were researching about a particular also the forms, how this, let's say, undercover operation were done. So how they were done?
Well, that's certainly difficult. I don't, it's a technique they probably perfected, so I don't know how they do it.
But how they used to do?
How they used it. Well, I wish I knew all the stories. But certainly one is, all kinds of sort of rivalry, all kinds of ideological appeal to some of left-leaning people. And then sex was used to blackmail some important people. And then, of course, they distributed Soviet passport to those who wanted to have them just as an assurance.
It's, for instance, where in Mongolia, for instance, or where?
More in Xinjiang, in Chinese part, and then in Poland, in Western Ukraine. Well, Poland wouldn't like it, but yes, in Galicia, they certainly did it. To what extent, we don't know. And I am certain that in Crimea they did it, Russia did it, and the Eastern Donbas did it. And today I just read a news piece that the mayor of Odessa, I don't remember his name, he has a Russian passport. I think this is a legacy. In Ukraine case, this may be a legacy of Russia's imperial root. Where does one belong? Can we have dual citizenship, Russian citizenship and Ukrainian citizenship? Some of them may have been given by the Russians. Some may have been sought Russian citizenship just in case Ukraine might become a problem. But if the mayor of Odessa has Russian citizenship, that's very serious. See, but I don't know. I just read the news story somewhere today, this morning.
Yeah, that was our network. We had investigated.
I think here and then, even Ukrainian administration, the government, there are various people who succumb to Russia's appeals, Russia's blackmailing, and acting to help Russians. We don't know who they are. We may not call them spies or informers, but of course they cultivate these people. All other countries do to one extent or another, sure.
You spent a lot of time in the archives, in the Soviet archives, researching the crimes of the Stalin regime. Now looking at Russia, looking at this, bit revival of Stalinism, it's public, when there is more appreciation in the media by even by the head of the state in Russia. How do you see it, and why it's possible with all this knowledge? How do you see that revival of Stalinism in Russia? I mean, the image of Stalin.
Yeah, since the 1980s, since Gorbachev came to power, there are many polls about how the Russians think about Stalin or these rulers. It sort of went up and down. Sometimes Stalin was very, very low, sometimes Stalin was very high. I think right now it's very high. And here, my guess is that Putin, after the humiliation of the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the weakening of Russia, somehow made Russia into the world stage. Again, we are showing that we can do something, and America and the West couldn't control us. That may be, creating Russians' sense of pride as a big power. And I think that was certainly there under Stalin. And even though Stalin killed so many people, including so many Russians, including so many Russian Orthodox church priests, somehow they forget about all this and say that, wow, Stalin kept the Soviet Union.
How do you explain that for yourself? As a historian, how do you explain that revival?
I mean, most empires got rid of that sense. If we look at the British Empire, French Empire, German Empire, Japanese Empire, they came to the conclusion, after World War II, that we cannot control the world this way. So I think they accepted colonial independence and so on. I think right now United States doesn't behave overtly as an empire, but certainly the United States have that tendency. But the most important actors are now Russia and China, which are sort of behaving exactly like empires, expanding territory without learning the lessons of the 20th century.
So thanks a lot.